The Lift+Love podcast is rooted in faith, family, and the conviction that loving LGBTQ people is a calling to be embraced, not feared. Produced by the Lift+Love team, we focus on topics relevant to Latter-day Saint LGBTQ individuals and their parents, relatives, friends, and others who are navigating this space with faith. Across episodes, hosts from the Lift+Love team and their guests address current topics, offer practical support, and share experiences related to LGBTQ+ issues. Each conversation is grounded in compassion, honesty, and a commitment to keep families connected to each other and Christ. Learn more and access resources at liftandlove.org. Lisa Diamond is a developmental psychologist whose research has reshaped scientific understanding of sexual orientation, gender identity, and well-being. She has published widely on transgender and non-binary youth, with particular attention to how social acceptance shapes mental health outcomes. She holds a PhD in human development from Cornell University and has been on faculty at the University of Utah since 1999. Wow, 27 years in Utah. I've known Lisa for several years now, and the reason I'm excited to have her on is because not only has Lisa been a constant support to what we do, but as a non-LDS person who's lived in Utah for 27 years, she's got her finger on the pulse of the LDS community and this intersection of LGBTQ. And she is gentle and thoughtful and lovely about the way she interacts in that space. And that's what we need, because so many polarizing messages are hard for people to take. And you just have the right message. You're always advocating and doing research to help this population and help parents and especially to help the children to grow up to be healthy and to thrive, to thrive.
And the whole family to
Right.
thrive. I mean, families are systems.
They are.
When any member of the family is not well, the family's not well.
And we all know
exactly
that
right.
this is such an understudied and under-researched field that your work is just so essential.
And if we had a researcher who hadn't been immersed in this population for so long, they wouldn't understand the careful and thoughtfulness of their parents come to this and the complicating factors that make it hard for them to sort of enter into this gender space. But then they've got all this hesitancy, but then they've got this child that they love and they want to care for. And that is a beginning of a really hard uphill road for parents. So that's why we brought you here to teach us. I can't wait. I can't wait. So let's talk we were talking before we started about terms and how we identify, especially gender, but anybody in the LGBTQ community. And you're so wise about that. So why don't you tell us what your theories are there?
Terms keep evolving, and folks often ask me what's the right term to use. And I always say the right term to use, at least in the family, is what the family member wants you to use. Because at least from the perspective of the community, there is incredible diversity. I think the term that's most used, like in the media, is LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus or LGBTQIA plus, and people say, why do letters keep getting added? And I say that is evidence of the diversity of this population.
Exactly.
That in the 90s, when I was going to graduate school, people didn't even really see bisexuals as a real phenomenon, which now we think, how could people not think that? It just shows that our awareness of the existence of sexual and gender diversity has evolved a lot. And the addition of the different letters really tracks stages in the development of our culture and the research culture about realizing just how many different facets of sexual and gender diversity exist. And the addition of letters is always an attempt to represent something that was underrepresented. The terms that I use in my research and that many other researchers use are sexually diverse and gender diverse, because it is the diversity that is the issue. It is the existence of that is the issue. And so gender diverse really describes any individual whose gender expression or identity differs in some way from their birth sex. Some of those individuals may identify as trans, some may not. Some may identify as non-binary, some may identify as agender, as not even really identifying with a gender. And what all of those have in common is that they differ from the expectations of society with regard to conventional, this expectation that everybody's gender is exactly what their birth assigned gender is. And that is the code of gendered expectations that ends up causing a lot of the oppression and the distress that individuals experience if they differ from that. And it's the same with sexual diversity. I kind of skip over LGBTQ and now I just say sexually diverse. And sexual diversity is just any form of sexual identity and expression that deviates from the expectation of heterosexuality. And so that may be someone who identifies as gay. It may be someone who has same gender attractions, but still identifies as heterosexual, but knows that there's something about themselves that is different from the expectations of society. It's really important to keep in mind that it is those expectations of society that are the source of the distress. It's when we measure ourselves against those expectations and find that we don't fit. That's where the distress comes from. And so sexual and gender diversity are shorthands for saying anyone who differs in any way from the expectations of society. That includes asexuality too, which we now realize also an orientation. And many individuals who are asexual grow up feeling, what's wrong with me? Why am I different? It's always the experience of difference that causes the distress.
That's such a good point. And that's where we get into the mental health issues, is when we're in distress, right? Okay, so I just quickly, and I'm sure you both heard me say this, but I always say to people, because people they just like, the number one thing people say to me, I don't get it. I just don't get gender diversity. Which I say, okay, like let's go from 0, which is like the most like like you can't tell whether this human is male or female. And we've all seen it, right? To, let's use someone from popular culture, Barbie. Barbie's 10, and this person who kind of shows up in between is 0. Where would you plot yourself on that line, 0 to 10? And I think when you start thinking, wow, I love jewelry, makeup, clothes, like pink, but I definitely wouldn't see myself as a 10 on on that, like a Barbie 10 on that spectrum. I definitely have masculine qualities, and there are things about me that are very kind of more towards 0, right? So if I say 7, that shows that I feel like, okay, I'm on a spectrum. So now I can see everybody.
And if you had grown up in, I don't know, Zimbabwe, that would manifest different because every culture has rules about gender. And some cultures make a big deal about gender differences and some cultures don't. Some cultures allow for a third gender category or a more ambiguous category. Other cultures don't. So gender diversity has been observed in every single culture that has been studied. It is a human phenomenon, and it's really our responses to it that vary. And when we grow up in a particular culture, I think it's really important to understand that culture is not just a set of rules that we learn, like you're reading a book. You wear this and you do this. We now know that because of the incredible plasticity of human brains, when we grow up in a culture with certain expectations and rules and norms, and we're sucking up that information from literally the moment we come out of the womb. Our brains are making neural connections at an exponential rate in the first 5 years of life. We're just literally building our brains while we are flying them. And so when we take in the rules and the norms of our culture, we're not just learning something. That learning is literally becoming a part of our brain. It's becoming embodied. We now know this to be true. And so when individuals say, well, I know what it means to be like a woman or a man. I feel it. I know it. We have to understand that some of that knowing and that feeling is in fact coming from culture. It's just that we are in fact literally sort of digesting the cultural rules and systems, and they are becoming in us the way language does. I mean, think about language. You are not born with your native language. You acquire it, but once you acquire it, it is in you. You can never unnativize the first language you learn. When you learn a language that early, it becomes a way that your brain functions. People who haven't spoken their native language for years will sometimes dream in their native language, or when they're dying, they will use their native language. And it just shows you that these are not just things we learn, they become part of us. And I think that that helps for people to understand how their own deep knowing of something, the fact that they know it deeply and they experience it as being so powerful and profound, doesn't mean it didn't come from the rules around them. It's just that humans, the way humans evolved, we have these incredibly plastic brains. We take our surrounding environment and we digest it, and it becomes a part of us. And so you can't just unlearn everything you learned about gender. And I think that is sometimes why parents struggle so much. They say, I'm trying to learn all these new things, and it's so difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
it is
it's
difficult
also
because the rules learned really they're in your brain.
I think it also shows why our kids are able to do so fluidly accept all of this, and because we've been programmed, I think of my generation as kind of this bridging between my parents who have been loving and accepting of my trans kid, but also my kids who they don't even blink. It's just like, oh yeah, that's, their pronouns are this and blah, blah, blah. And they just move on. Yeah. Whereas others might stutter because that hasn't been part of their development and it hasn't been absorbed into their plastic brains.
Absolutely true. And I think we have to sort of appreciate that the brains of individuals who grew up hearing in newspapers and television in radio in songs, folks who grow up hearing that non-binary people exist, that you don't take pronouns for granted, that literally they are growing up with a more expansive brain when it comes to gender. It's going to be easier for them to understand. And so parents of, say, my generation, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm about to turn 55. We did not grow up hearing about gender diversity. We didn't encounter it. So it is always harder for an older generation to even feel like they understand where their kid is coming from when their kid has grown up with a more expansive notion of gender from the beginning.
I love that.
The thing about this is that human brains never stop being plastic. Our brains continue to be plastic.
Which is a good thing.
Parents, it's a fantastic thing because it means that whatever the rules were about gender that you grew up, like, yes, those are your native understandings of gender that you grew up with. You can add to them. We can never subtract, right? Human brain plasticity is additive. We can't unlearn things we learned. We can add new neural connections and new forms of knowledge and new ways of seeing the world. And that never ends. That is ever growing.
Love it.
And I think that's a part of that patience in the family is we're all adapting. We are all still growing. We are making new neural pathways together, and they take time. what really changes the way our brains function is repetition. It's just repeatedly re-encountering. Every time a parent struggles with pronouns, if you keep struggling, it'll get easier. Your brain is designed to adapt and to learn. It just takes a little time and a little grace as everybody's making the adjustment together.
I know that when I have like hosted or led the discussion on the parent support group we have for trans and non-binary kids, youth, the number one question, these people come in like deer in the headlights and they're like, my kid wants to get on hormones. And they're just so paranoid about all the misinformation that is like the number one thing. There are others who are like, oh, it was life-saving for my kid. Please don't be too afraid. And, I'm happy to talk to you about it. But that's the one thing that like I know has been this recurring. I don't host it often. Someone else is the stand-in, or I'm the stand-in for her. But that is one thing that is always like, what do we do? Yeah.
Let's just quickly go over a couple of general definitions. Gender versus assigned sex at birth.
So assigned sex at birth is basically what we used to call biological sex. The reason we don't use the term biological sex is because there actually isn't one biological sex. There's actually 6. There's chromosomal status, which is XX versus XY. Chromosomes, what they do is they code for body plans, the infant's bodily development. And so in the first trimester of development, an XX versus XY, and actually the default body plan for an infant is female. That's the basis, which is interesting because most of society assumes that like, men are the basis for everything. Actually, the default body in the first trimester, the Y chromosome codes for the development of testes versus ovaries. So once the testes versus ovaries develop, they start, and so that's the second layer of biological sexual differentiation is the gonads, testes versus ovaries. Then the third layer is gonadal hormone exposures, because the testes and the ovaries both secrete testosterone and estrogen, but in different ratios. And it's the ratio of testosterone to estrogen that continues to direct the development of the body. So that ratio of hormone exposure is that third layer. Then the fourth layer is the development of the internal reproductive anatomy that is responsible for, reproduction. Then the fourth layer is the development of the external anatomy, which is not the same as the internal anatomy, right? The development of the vulva is different from the development of the uterus and the ovaries. And then the sixth layer is post-pubertal development, where you get secondary sex characteristics like the development of breasts and musculature. So there's actually 6 different layers of sexual differentiation. But at birth, we only look at one. We look at the external genitalia, which doesn't tell you whether or not there's even a uterus or ovaries in there, because they can. And for all of these, in general, for the majority of folks, they line up in the same way. So that, if you had an XY, you also had, a certain level, you had, testes, and you had a certain level of hormone exposure, and you have the internal and the external, and it all lines up together. But for each one of those layers, there is variation. And we actually never even observe the variation. We just assume. And so that's really what happens when we see the baby being born and we see a penis or a vulva. We assume that all the other layers lined up and that we have a boy versus a girl. But we never actually know. It's only if there are anomalies in the genitalia at birth, or if the child doesn't go through puberty at the expected age, and the physician might be like, well, let's do some tests and see what we can find out. Then sometimes they'll find like, oh my gosh, because there's a lot of different reasons that you have variation in those other layers of sexual differentiation. And there are so many. Like if you dive into the biology of this, it's just like every other aspect of human variation. Humans vary. And
eyes
so
and
that
heart
is why,
function and lungs and brain capacity, everything. I know it's so
yeah,
hard for us to
yeah,
take hold of it because we haven't studied it and it hasn't been part of conversation. But yes, every single system of our body is so varied and
varies.
complicated.
And so that's why saying assign sex at birth or assign gender at birth. And I actually think it's more accurate to say kind of assigned gender because that's really what we're doing. We're saying once we decide what we think your biological status is, we then give you a social category. We call you a boy or a girl, and then a whole bunch of things flow from that. And we know that from experimental studies that adults touch babies differently, whether depending on whether they think it's a boy baby or a
Interesting.
girl baby. We talk to them differently. Parents use more emotion words with girls than they use with boys. So once we assign a gender with a word, and my friend and colleague Catherine Stockton, who wrote a whole book called
Mm.
Genders, by MIT Press, and one of the things she says is once we use that word, boy or girl, it kind of lowers like a cone over that child, and everything else is sort of filtered through that. And we sort of imagine that that's just natural. Boys do this and girls do that, and that's just the way it is. It goes along with what we can see. But again, we're never really seeing the full range of biological variation. And so we're just kind of projecting
Yeah.
an idea of what we think is true for that child. And it works well enough most of the time so that the system is maintained. And part of this is just the fact that humans have to categorize complex systems and observations into chunks, into categories. Otherwise, we can't function. We see the complex world, we have to boil it down. We are always losing information when we do that, but we have to do it. We have to use these kind of categorical shortcuts to function. And so we should forgive ourselves that we're so drawn to using categories, even though we're always aware that the categories are limited. Our brains have to use them, but we need to be aware that when we use those categories, there's a lot of human
Yeah.
involvement in making and obeying the laws of those categories. We are not perceiving the world in all of its complexity. And so when we lower that cone with a word on a child or a boy or a girl, we're making a whole bunch of
Yeah.
assumptions about what is
And that,
true
oh,
for that kid. And we never get a chance to confirm or disconfirm that. And so then when parents say, I was shocked, I was shocked, well, it's because we have a way of thinking about gender that is necessarily kind of limiting and categorical. And so we're selectively
mhm.
ignoring a lot of information that we may not have access to. You don't know what the hormonal milieu of your child's first trimester of development was. And so we just have to realize that there is so much complexity in gender that we will never observe about ourselves or other
Mhm.
people. And that diversity is real. And now we kind of scientifically know that it exists. But at a sort of conventional wisdom level, we're still relatively unaware of it. And so that's why it's more accurate to say gender assigned at birth. We make a guess based on the penis of the vulva. We make a guess, and that guess is good enough most of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And when it's not, we just have to be like, well, it was a
Yeah.
guess.
So, two
Right.
things that came to my mind while you were sharing that, Lisa. Number one, how brave and courageous of our gender diverse and gender expansive people to have been given this cone, these societal expectations, and to have the courage to, at some point in their lives, hopefully, but for some not, to say, this cone doesn't fit, or this isn't, I'm
Yeah.
not fitting these structures. I mean, even One of seven, the first girl. I was sandwiched between four boys. My mom kept wanting to put dresses on me and dolls in my room. And I'm like, I want the G.I. Joe action figures. I want pants and I want to go roll in the dirt, And she's like, let's sign you up for ballet and baton twirling. Meanwhile, I'm sidelined with my brothers playing soccer and baseball and all the things. And I just never had those experiences because I was given a different cone. But I think of like my trans daughter at age 18 or 19 saying, this doesn't fit. This doesn't fit. And the second thought that goes along with that is I'm so grateful that we as a society, at least in, our Eurocentric area, we finally caught up with the language where people at a younger age can say, oh, I think I know what this means for me. I know of other trans people. Michael Soto, for example, comes to mind, who has said, I didn't know a word for it, but I knew I was a man. I knew I was a man.
The non-binary.
And so
I think the non-binary, like usage is another great example of that, because that word, and you can use Google Ngram Viewer to track the usage of words in published texts over time. And non-binary kind of stays really, 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 really low. And then around 2010, 2011, boom. And so a whole bunch of folks suddenly said, wait a second, it's not just
I can do that. I can do that.
That's a thing. Because up until that point, we only had one way of talking about gender diversity. But again, think about all those layers of differentiation. We now know that there are more individuals who identify as non-binary than individuals who identify as binary trans. Because think about all that variation. Of course. Think about all the different places along that spectrum. But a lot of those individuals, they felt like the only way to identify as something other than their birth assigned gender was to identify as just the completely other gender. And many of them, once the non-binary option, but they realized it was a thing, said, that was always a little bit closer to what I experienced. I just thought I was the only one.
Well, then you got the language.
Well, and it's like bisexuality, right?
Some people might be, it's exactly
like
the same way. We used to not think bisexual. It's a larger proportion. And when the data on this first started to sort of come out, because we really started to collect better data on those, on how many individuals identified with those terms, we finally started to collect better data like around like the early 2000s. And I would look at the data coming out, and every year, more folks who previously would have identified as exclusively gay or lesbian said, well, I'm actually more in that bisexual range. And I would give talks and I'd be like, there's more folks who are on the bisexual spectrum than are exclusively same gender attracted. But in the past, the only identity label available was gay or lesbian. Once more individuals realized that term, bisexual or pansexual, and the difference, a lot of people are confused about the difference, and different individuals use them in different ways. One way to understand the difference is that bisexual individuals are more likely to say, I'm attracted to both genders. Pansexual individuals often say, gender, like any gender, all genders, I have no gender restrictions. So some individuals kind of view bisexual and pansexual as kind of synonymous. What links them together is that there's a capacity, a very broad capacity for sexual attraction and behavior. And non-binary as a gender identity is similar in that it is a broader range of gendered identifications. Some non-binary individuals will say, I identify with aspects of both, the masculine and the feminine. Others will say neither. I think nothing about me is gendered at all. So those are very different experiences. And so again, we're taking complexity and we're narrowing it down by creating a category called non-binary. But whenever we call something a category, we just have to remember that's a shortcut. it's sort of a mental shortcut that we have to use. A heuristic is sort of a word like a mental shortcut. And so with both the bisexual category and the non-binary category, once individuals became aware of them and those words entered the popular consciousness, then a whole bunch of folks suddenly started to adopt those identities. And you look at the big difference in the number of individuals who identify as sexually diverse or gender diverse in Gen Z as opposed to older populations, it's much higher. And individuals always ask me, what happened? Like, did we make
Is it
more
'cause we
queer
accepted
people? And I
them?
say, what happened was a lot of it, because all of that increase, like nearly all of that increase, is in the non-binary and the bisexual
Really?
categories. A whole bunch of individuals, like not all of it, but if you look at the sort of stats for each progressive generation, what really happened is that a lot of individuals who were always there, but didn't see those categories as applying to them because the categories were defined so restrictively. Gen Z just had a broader way of understanding all of these things. And Gen Z, sort of like, yeah, you can be mostly heterosexual, and that still counts as being somewhere on the sexually diverse spectrum. Or you can be someone who looks like a conventional woman or a conventional man, but experiences your gender as more non-binary and more complex, and that counts. Come on in. The water's fine. So we did not make more gay people. We did not make more gender diverse people. What we did was socially, we changed the definition of who might be able to view their own experience within the lens of sexual and gender diversity. And then a whole bunch of people who 15 years ago would have said, I'm not completely heterosexual or cisgender, but I don't think I'm gay or trans. I'm just like, I don't know, but I'm just not going to talk about it. Those are the individuals that in Gen Z were like, oh yeah, I'm there.
Yeah.
I'm in there. And I think that's part of the reason that a lot of parents are sometimes suspicious. They're like, I don't understand. I mean, growing up, there were some gay people, but not that many.
Yeah.
And now it seems like all of my kids' friends are queer or trans. What? That can't be.
Right.
It can't be. It's got to be social media. It's got to be social influence. It is not social media. It is not social influence. The social media aspect of it is that once Gen Z sort of had a broader definition of gender and sexuality, social media made it easier for that knowledge to spread so that more individuals could say, wait, non-binary is a thing? Wait, it's a thing? So the difference is that we expanded who could see themselves in those categories to include individuals with more mixed and variable experiences. It's the knowledge that is contagious, not the identity. Knowledge is contagious. And we have radically changed in our society the way individuals gain knowledge about sexuality and gender. And so I think it's really important for parents to understand that it's not that friends influence their kid. It's that this generation has a broader definition of those categories, and it's easier for young people to hear about and find out about that diversity now than ever before. I mean, we really have to think about the introduction of smartphones as an information revolution with regard to sexuality and gender that is unprecedented in human history.
Yeah.
When we gave folks these little devices and we connect them to the internet and we gave them to young people, we gave them access to more information about sexuality and gender as they are experienced on planet Earth. We gave them more information than any human has ever had in the history of the world. Because sexuality and gender are some of the topics that cultures protect and close off and gatekeep more than anything else. And when we gave folks this, we said, everything you ever want to know about every culture on the planet. Go find out about it. Here, just every question. It's all there. There's no precedent. There's no precedent in human history for being able to see that much diversity. And so the explosion in Gen Z is a knowledge explosion. It's related to the transmission of information.
Well, and I don't think we've increased our conversations with our kids about sexuality and gender to match the information that they have coming in. We're still having roughly some and maybe none conversations.
And not just conversations, but the parents are probably not as knowledgeable as the kids are. You know, parents aren't learning about this, but kids are saying, hey, in the Samoan culture, they have this third gender, and male, feminine men are fafafini, and just learning like, all these things. And the parents are saying, no, this is just man and woman. It's just... And so without that catching up,
I think that raises...
there's going to be the gap.
I think that raises a great, I think, opportunity for connection for parents and gender diverse youth, which is for the parents to actually invite their kid to teach them something.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
To say,
what do you know?
You might actually know more than I grew up knowing. And I feel pretty confident about what I know about gender. And I'm willing to admit that you might actually know some things I don't know. Honored if you would teach me some things. I love that.
We hope you've enjoyed part 1 of this discussion with Dr. Lisa Diamond. You'll find part 2 of this episode right now on the Lift+Love YouTube channel.
Thank you for joining us. If you like what we share, subscribe to the Lift+Love podcast. And if you have a minute, leave us a 5-star rating so other families like yours can find us. When your child comes out, you need to find support where you feel safe and understood. This is why we created the Lift+Love community, a place where families can connect, learn, and grow in a private setting. If you feel like you need more information, support, or resources, check out liftandlove.org and liftandlove.org on Instagram and Facebook. But most importantly, remember, you are not alone in this journey. We are building a community of thriving, faithful LGBTQ individuals and their families who are here to lift and love you.